Hey folks, this is Alexandros from Pecunia at Bellum, which means in Latin wealth and war. This isn't your usual video on international relations theory, and you might be wondering why my narrator avatar looks a bit like bush camouflage. Like a guerrilla, I'm trying to kill academic boredom with hybrid and unconventional tactics. In January, however, just to mention, I will be joining the conventional forces of the Hellenic military, as our aggressive Aegean neighbor is the reason for this to be a compulsory thing in Greece in the first place. Thanks, Turkey. Given the situation, I am only experimenting with a short series right now. This also explains why my audio sounds pretty basic, as I have no motivation to invest in professional sound equipment a year before I even get the chance to learn how to use it. But hopefully the bar is set quite low thanks to all these Zoom courses you're listening to. To make it sound simple, the field of international relations concentrates on the study of the relations between states. It's not the cherries per se, it's the knot that holds the cherries together. This does involve organizations as well, I mean international organizations, as well as non state actors like, for example, ISIS, but the emphasis remains on the state as it is the discipline's fundamental unit. IR, short for International Relations, is an offspring of political science and philosophy, a child that, in my opinion, has surpassed its nerdy parent. It concentrates on the cool stuff, international affairs, rather than the majority of dull domestic politics. Despite that, the world is a bit more interconnected than it was, and some knowledge of domestic politics is considered a must. Not that it wasn't before, but now it's even more. In fact, IR is such an intrusive and interdisciplinary science that some people prefer to call it, with a broader term, international studies. Because of how things stand right now with Facebook and Twitter, it is much easier for everybody to stay up to date with the most important global events. The more traditional and conservative parts of society still have their televisions, and in the case of Greece, the cafenio. A cafenio is a cafeteria which is basically marketed at the older male population of the age 50 and above. They all consider themselves experienced veterans of normal urban life who have lived through the glorious age of PASOK, and so with little to no information they usually get polarized regarding a specific matter of politics of which they usually knew nothing about until like yesterday. Would learning history solve a situation at the cafenio? History is a descriptive science. What IR has to offer instead is something of a more critical approach. But, yes, it does rely a lot on learning history. Think of history as a mine of aluminium. You extract the ore as it is, which is the raw material, the data that you're getting from the earth, but then you're using a blueprint in order to take this aluminium and turn it into a bicycle, for example. Then, if the blueprint works well, you have a nice bicycle which is aerodynamic, which rides well, which is safe, and can get you to the destination that you want. It is important to mention that, much like psychology, international relations is something that was developed in the 20th century. There are several reasons for that. What I have already mentioned is the rise of flow of information and globalization. Globalization means that the world is getting more and more interconnected, and consequently, it almost feels like events happening far away can still have dire consequences in your domestic land. Hence, the distance and how we perceive it between countries is becoming narrower. A good manifestation of this phenomenon has always been trade. Remember at school? How do they understand, these archaeologists, that two civilizations communicated with each other? By finding goods, finding traces of goods and products that were originally exclusive to one region. The second reason is the rise of democracy and the growth of the civil society. Before the World War One, not that we don't have it now, but aristocracy was kind of the norm. It wasn't the mere folk that was handling diplomacy and foreign policy and stuff, it was the royals, the aristocrats, the courtier, and the lackey. But due to higher involvement of the folks beyond the state later, we have what we may call track 1 diplomacy and track 2 diplomacy. Last but not least, Our experiences as humanity from the 20th century is something that, of course, has developed international relations as it is, as well as nuclear deterrence. We are more afraid of war from what is known within the books of history and oral tradition regarding World War II specifically, rather than what is happening right in front of our noses. And on top of that, the fact that a single country or a few can cause the apocalypse causes somewhat of an existential crisis. You cannot leave your legacy behind if all of your tomorrow is dead from nuclear weapons. And when you're in existential thought, you tend to write a lot. Now, just because the intellectual history of the science is quite recent, that does not mean that our material does not go all the way back to antiquity. In fact, we borrow most of our knowledge from Mama history. Thucydides and Machiavelli, for example, are still considered daddies of international relations. It is no wonder that Graham Allison, the Harvard professor and the author of Destined for War, uses the term Thucydides trap. And analysts, of course, do still try to apply IR theory to social units preceding the state. The official birthday of the state, or better, the Westphalian state, is the year 1648, which marks the end of the 30 Years' War and the deterioration of the papal influence. To make a note here, I will be describing the general approaches and the aspects of the theories which are more commonly found. It is how I understand what I know in a nutshell, and the purpose is to set a pace for future analysis. Realism is the cynical one. It's liked both by boomers and doomers. It gets too real. It hurts your feelings so that it doesn't hurt your national security. Rather than seeing war as an interruption of peace, realism admits that peace is a period interrupting two wars. War, according to realism, is caused by human nature, bad governance, but most importantly because of the anarchic international system. It's called anarchic since there is no central sovereign, no central authority that could prevent conflicts. The United Nations is an attempt to create an international governor that imposes international governance. But even the Security Council resolutions, for example, cannot impose peace or quiet, especially when all the major powers have to serve their own conflicting national interests. The term national interest is a compass that answers the question what is the best for the survival and the further development of my state? It is also worth mentioning that realism likes and flirts with strategic studies and geopolitics. On the other end, we have idealism, which could be easily represented by a single tarot card, the Fool. To make it short, idealists argue that human nature is inherently good, and since we're both smart, ethical, and for the most part democratic, we can all agree that war is bad for business. So, if war is bad for business and useless, we may as well abolish it and lower our defense budgets, and maybe fund our schools and hospitals instead. How do we prevent war? By creating economic chains of interdependency, because breaking them makes things more expensive, which people hate. Spreading democracy works, and following the rules set by international law. Now, the international society approach tries to be somewhere in the middle and balance between the reality of realism and what we want to achieve with idealism. Constructivists, on the opposite, try to reflect on the situation. They claim that nothing exists out of the context, that the state is not something that came on its own from the material world, it's not something natural, but rather a social construct of ours. One thing I always try to mention is that despite each approach being its own individual thing, some elements of them can be still mixed and combined. For instance, international law does have some realistic characteristics. In international maritime law, the initial width of the territorial sea was 3 nautical miles. Why 3 and not 2 or 4? That's how far a coastal cannon can shoot. On the flip side, within the framework of strategic studies, a country that respects international rules, conventional, customary, or unwritten political rules, will be more respected by the other players. It will gain more international legitimacy. This sums up this video. Thank you all for watching so far, as this is my first try, and remember that this is an introduction to an introduction. There are many things to polish, but this is something that I wanted to initiate for years now, and hopefully this video will get things going. Let's stay in touch, y'all, and don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as check our website Pecunia at Bellum. Stay informed and stay safe.